Battlefield 6 drops tomorrow, and we were granted early access to do some benchmarking, so of course I took full advantage of that opportunity, testing 43 different graphics cards at 3 resolutions using 2 quality presets, along with a few additional tests that look at stuff like preset scaling and then FSR and DLSS scaling. I've also got some image quality comparisons to go over, so there is a lot to cover, but before we get into it,
Today's video is sponsored by Gigabyte's GeForce RTX 50 series gaming laptops. The Aorus Master 18 and 16 are super high performance beasts with up to RTX 5090 laptop graphics, stunning 240Hz HDR displays, and top-end features like a PCIe Gen 5 SSD and Wi-Fi 7. The Aero X16 Copilot Plus PC is the perfect choice for gamers and creators on the go, with a portable chassis, up to RTX 5070 laptop graphics, and a high-resolution Pantone validated display. The gaming A16 and A16 Pro are also available with up to RTX 5080 laptop graphics, wind force cooling, and overall great bang for buck. With NVIDIA GeForce RTX graphics, you have access to superb performance and cutting-edge features like DLSS 4 transformer model upscaling and 4x multi-frame generation. To learn more about Gigabyte's RTX 50 series gaming laptops, check the links in the description.
okay, so I think it's fair to say that Battlefield 6 is a game that really needs no introduction. We checked the performance out for the open beta covering the multiplayer portion of the game back in August, and I was impressed with what I saw. So since then, I've wanted to provide a big GPU benchmark, but I knew doing so with the multiplayer portion of the game wasn't really going to be possible, given the run-to-run variance between matches, which can be quite significant. Thankfully though, it was possible to access the single-player campaign during the early access period, so this is how I'm testing 43 GPUs using the most demanding section of the game that I could find, which was the third mission. So this is where I conducted all of my testing. Anyway, we should probably get into the data, and please note I'm using the Ryzen 7 9800X3D with 32GB of DDR5 6000 memory, along with the latest display drivers available at the time of testing. Okay, let's get into it. First up, before we get into the preset scaling FPS data, here's a quick look at image quality, just to give you some idea of how they compare visually, and yes, I have skipped over the Ultra preset as High and Overkill are extremely similar. So rather than clutter the screen with additional comparisons, I've just removed Ultra altogether. Here you can see that for the most part, the Overkill and High presets are very similar. Overkill increases shadow quality ever so slightly, with sharper, more defined shadows, whereas they are a bit softer with the High preset. Then from High to Medium, it's again very difficult to spot any real differences in this scene, and again shadow quality is slightly reduced, becoming a bit softer again, but it's hardly a massive difference. Even the Low preset looks quite good in this example. Some of the detail on the gun is now lost, and texture quality is worse, but overall it's not significantly worse, and I'd say the developer has done a good job of minimizing the areas where the texture quality is noticeably degraded. Shadow and lighting quality is worse, but again not significantly so, not to the point where the game does look significantly worse. It's really a surprisingly small downgrade that often isn't noticed when actually playing the game. Where you will more easily spot the difference between these presets is when looking more closely at objects. Take this truck wheel for example. Using the Overkill preset, the textures and detail are all reasonably good, and everything looks much the same with the High preset, though the shadow cast from the handrail is slightly lower in quality. But then from High to Medium, the most noticeable downgrade is again the shadows. The shadow cast by the handrail is pretty much gone now, and the textures on the wheel hub are slightly downgraded, but overall certainly not significantly worse. Then we have the Low preset, and here textures are noticeably worse, with quite a bit of the detail now missing, but still overall not a bad presentation, especially given this is the lowest quality preset in the game. Now we're not focusing on a single object up close, the presets often do look very similar. The wheel arches on the distant white vehicle become more jagged with the Medium and Low presets, whereas this detail is smoothed out using the High and Overkill presets, but overall very similar detail, as in the number of objects is much the same between the various presets, which is why Low does look so impressive. And as you're about to see, the Low preset often offers around 70% better performance when compared to Overkill, and if we compare the two side by side here, it is difficult to justify the use of the Overkill preset. Even in this cutscene, the difference between the maximum and minimum quality settings is surprisingly small. The most noticeable thing here is the texture quality, and admittedly, even that isn't huge, but if we slow the footage down right here, you can see a pretty big difference, and this is seen when looking at the floor of the vehicle. The texture quality is significantly higher with the Overkill preset. It's also a much sharper and detailed image with better shadow and lighting effects. Then as we assault the beach, you can see higher quality textures on the sand, though the difference here isn't massive, especially given the difference in performance. Now, for those of you wondering, here is how the Overkill and High presets compare for the same cutscene. Generally speaking, they are identical, or certainly near enough to be called identical. Even if we pause when jumping into the vehicle, you can see just how similar the two are. The lighting does look nicer with the Overkill preset, and again you can see higher quality shadows, so there is no denying that Overkill is the best looking preset, but a lot of the time you really do have to go looking for the improvements, especially when compared to the High preset. Okay, so here's a look at how the presets scale in terms of performance, and for this testing I'm going to compare what are really two current generation, sort of more entry-level GPUs, the 16GB versions of the 5060 Ti and 9060 XT. Using the low preset, performance is excellent at native 1440p, 108 FPS for the 9060 XT and 118 FPS for the 5060 Ti, making the GeForce GPU 9% faster. Then with the medium preset, the 9060 XT only saw a 6% performance hit, and then 8% for the 5060 Ti. Both are still able to render over 100 FPS on average. Now with the high preset, frame rates did dip below 100 FPS, but still excellent performance overall, though the GeForce GPU is now 12% faster. Then with the Ultra preset, the GeForce GPU is 10% faster, rendering 89 FPS on average, compared to 81 FPS for the 9060 XT. Finally, even when using the Overkill preset, the average frame rates remained above 60 FPS, and here the 5060 Ti was 9% faster on average. Now, although the majority of the testing will be conducted at the native resolution, I do have some FSR and DLSS scaling data for the 9060 XT and 5060 Ti. Again, at the native resolution using the Overkill preset, the GeForce GPU was 9% faster, and we see when enabling quality upscaling that the margin grows ever so slightly to 11%, but more crucially, the 5060 Ti saw a 40% performance boost when compared to native, and the 9060 XT a 38% boost. Then from the quality setting to balanced, we saw a further 10 to 14% boost, then another 11 to 12% using performance, and then 19 to 20% with ultra performance. Okay, so starting with the Overkill data at 1080p, we see that despite using this extreme preset, the higher end GPUs have no trouble delivering a truly high refresh rate experience at this lower resolution. The RTX 5090 is obviously a beast, and the experience is pretty special at over 200 FPS. Still, even with much more modest GPUs such as the 7900 XT, 4070 Ti Super, RTX 5070 and RX 9070, performance was excellent with over 130 FPS on average. On that note, the RX 9070 did manage to just edge out the RTX 5070, while the 9070 XT was slower than the 5070 Ti, and by some margin, as here it was 11% slower. For around 100 FPS, GPUs such as the RTX 4070, 5060 Ti 16GB, 6800 XT, RTX 3080, and 7800 XT all worked well. Now, it's worth noting that the 8GB version of the 5060 Ti did not enjoy the Overkill settings. The average frame rate might look okay, but the performance overall was poor with horrible 1% lows. This was less of an issue for the 8GB 9060 XT thanks to the PCIe x 16 configuration, but even so, the 16GB version was still 17% faster when comparing the average frame rate and 32% faster for the 1% lows. So the Overkill preset really is too much for 8GB GPUs. The Intel Arc B580 did okay here, 66 FPS on average, so certainly playable performance, though it was much slower than the 16GB 4060 Ti. Beyond that, the Overkill preset is too much, and most of the GPUs struggling here did only have 8GB of VRAM. Now at 1440p, we're still seeing impressively high frame rates from the likes of the 5090 and 4090, I suppose no surprises there, while the RTX 5080 also performed well. Interestingly, however, the 9070 XT was only a fraction slower than the 5070 Ti, while the 7900 XTX was slightly ahead. This meant that the RX 9070 was now comfortably ahead of the RTX 5070, delivering 17% greater performance. The older RTX 3090 and 6950 XT were also quite evenly matched, though the GeForce GPU was the faster of the two. The RTX 5060 Ti also got the better of the 9060 XT, rendering 70 FPS on average, making it 9% faster. That said, we see a very different story when comparing the 8GB versions. Here the 9060 XT was 22% faster or 40% faster when comparing 1% lows, though truth be told neither was particularly impressive, with both falling short of 60 FPS. Beyond that, the performance is quite poor, so naturally you downgrade the quality preset. Native 4K is a performance killer, especially with the Overkill preset, but even so, 115 FPS from the RTX 5090 is very impressive performance. Especially given that a few weeks ago we were seeing 45 FPS in Borderlands 4 under similar conditions. Meanwhile, in Battlefield 6 you can achieve that level of performance with the 7900 GRE. Still, most of the GPUs here were limited to 60 FPS or less, so again you will want to enable upscaling and probably lower the preset to high, so let's go do that now. Backing the resolution down to 1080p with the high preset shows just how well optimized Battlefield 6 is, because again the game does look very good using the high preset. Testing the most demanding section of the campaign that we could find, we're still looking at over 200 FPS for the 5070 Ti, RTX 4090, 5080 and 5090. Sadly, there are no Radeon GPUs there, as the 9070 XT capped out at 179 FPS, which is well short of the 5070 Ti, so I'm not sure what's going on there. The 9070 and 9070 XT were very similar in terms of performance, so something is limiting the performance of these Radeon GPUs, either some kind of overhead issue, or perhaps it's a driver-related problem. Either way, performance overall was strong, just not quite as strong as what you might expect based on what the competing GeForce GPUs achieved. Anyway, these settings are much more relevant for lower-end models, and as we scroll down the graph, you might be surprised to see older parts like the RTX 4070 and 6800 XT pushing 130 FPS or more. Then for 100 FPS or better, the 6750 XT or RTX 4060 Ti 16GB worked well. But even for those of you with older entry-level GPUs such as the RX 6600, it's possible to play at over 60 FPS using these settings, while popular models such as the RTX 4060 are comfortably spitting out 70 FPS on average. Upping the resolution to 1440p still sees most of the more recently released mid-range to high-end GPUs rendering over 100 FPS. The RTX 5090 obviously had no issues, averaging over 200 FPS, while the 4090 and 5080 were also very fast. This time the 5070 Ti and 9070 XT are neck and neck at around 150 FPS, while the RX 9070, RTX 4080, 4080 Super and 7900 XTX are all very evenly matched. This meant that the RX 9070 was just 7% faster than the RTX 5070, which was matched by the older 7900 XT. The 5060 Ti was again too fast for the 9060 XT, with the 16GB models delivering 94 and 84 FPS respectively, handing the GeForce GPU a 12% lead. But when we look at the 8GB models, the 9060 XT version dropped 15% off the average frame rate and 33% for the 1% lows, while the 5060 Ti saw the average frame rate drop by 11% and the 1% lows by a much larger 24% margin. But not all of the 16/8GB variants were affected evenly. The 4060 Ti 8GB, for example, was 36% slower than its 16GB version. So even with the high preset, 8GB GPUs are suffering from a lack of VRAM, and it's unlikely that enabling DLSS or FSR upscaling is going to help. Still, many of the 8GB GPUs were still usable here, despite the weaker frame time performance, though a part like the 7600 XT did provide a better experience than the newer RTX 5060. Now finally at 4K, it's only the mighty RTX 5090 that can deliver a truly high refresh rate experience without the aid of upscaling. The RTX 4090 was good for just over 100 FPS, while the RTX 5080 was the third fastest GPU with 94 FPS, followed by the 5070 Ti, 9070 XT, and 7900 XTX. For just over 60 FPS, the RTX 4070 Super, 6950 XT, 7900 GRE, RTX 3090 or 5070 work well here, though you will want to enable at least quality upscaling. Then as you'd expect, the 8GB GPUs are no good here, and despite the fact that the 5060 Ti 16GB was capable of 50 FPS on average, meaning with balanced upscaling it would be very usable at 4K, the 8GB model simply has no chance, taking a 36% hit to the average frame rate, along with poor frame time performance. So there you have it. As we found in the open beta testing, Battlefield 6 is a very well optimized title that can be fully enjoyed using a wide range of hardware. That said, unless you have the latest and greatest gear, I'd recommend avoiding the Overkill preset, along with Ultra, and instead stick with high or even the medium presets. But it's worth noting that most modern GPUs, as long as they have at least 12GB of VRAM, will be fine using the Overkill preset with a little bit of upscaling. After all, the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB was good for roughly 100 frames per second on average when using quality upscaling at 1440p, and this was in the most demanding section of the game that we could find after a few hours of gameplay. The point is though, you will want to back down to the high preset. The overall presentation is very similar, and now the 5060 Ti 16GB will be able to deliver a truly high refresh rate experience with DLSS quality, rendering just over 130 FPS on average at 1440p. Even those of you with older GPUs, such as a Radeon RX 6600 or GeForce RTX 3060, you'll be able to enjoy Battlefield 6 at relatively high frame rates when playing at 1080p with the medium settings. So that's great news, and it should help with the popularity of Battlefield 6. And that is going to do it for this video. If you liked it, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content. And if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed member, we have the join button or Patreon. Signing up to either one of those things will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested. But if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.